Hi, this is Josh Kulp for Daf Shevui. We are learning this week Daf Nun Hey, page 55 of Masechet Avodah Zarah. And I want to concentrate on the second half of the Daf because I actually have quite a bit to say about this part. From this Daf onwards, the rest of the Masechet, with a few exceptions of digressions, will talk about the prohibition of Yain Nesech. Yain Nesech literally means libated wine that non-Jews, idolaters, have libated to their gods. The term Stam Yenam means wine that was touched by, or in any way, by a non-Jew and which we don't know was libated. And then there's yain that wasn't touched by them but was owned by them. We've encountered this a couple times throughout the Masechet. We will use the term, and the Gemara uses the term yain nesech, libated wine, even though usually what they really mean is stam yenam, wine that we don't know whether they libated it or not. So the Talmud takes this with great seriosity. They devote about 20 daf of Talmud, which is an enormous amount of Talmud, to it. You can see that the Mishnah is already very concerned, very strict about Jews not using or owning or selling or deriving benefit from non-Jewish wine. And it continues to be a prohibition till this day. I'm not going to talk throughout on my commentary too much about how it's observed today, but if you've been to a kosher restaurant where there are non-Jewish servers, you may see that they'll say, you, Mr. or Mrs. Jew, you should open your bottle yourself, because for strictly Orthodox Jews will not drink wine that was even poured by a non-Jew. And we'll see that as we come through the Masechet. The origins of this seem to be twofold. One is it comes from a way of keeping Jews away from truly idolatrous products. And it may be that at a certain point in history, most non-Jews, when they drank their wine, libated a little bit of it. They poured libation seems to be pouring a little bit out to the ground in honor of the gods. And it may be that at a certain point in history, non-Jews actually did this. The problem is that the prohibition extends far further than wine which we know was libated. It goes to really any time a non-Jew may have touched it, or a fear that he touched it, or owned it, and all sorts of harchakot, extensions of this prohibition, which leads us to the impression, which I think is correct, that prohibiting Jews from engaging with non-Jewish wine was a way of prohibiting Jews from engaging with idolaters, not with idolatry. But if you want to keep people away from each other, make sure they don't drink wine together. Now, I'm going to comment on this a little bit throughout our learning, but we're going to be talking about the Talmudic laws as they played out in Eretz Yisrael and in Babylonia. In France and Germany in particular, when Jews began to move there in the 10th and 11th centuries, these laws became exceedingly difficult to observe. And there may have been among the most difficult laws for Jews in the Middle Ages to observe, Jewish laws for them to observe. Chaim Soloveitchik, who is really, I think, one of the top professors, if not the top professor in the world in medieval Jewry, wrote at least 2 books on the subject and a whole bunch of articles about how medieval Jews coped with this. Some are in English, but mostly they are in Hebrew. So I just want to go through some of the differences in the conditions in Germany and in France in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries that were very different from Babylonia, and particularly from Babylonia in an earlier period. So one is that wine was a major product in France and Germany in this period. Wine was cultivated extensively in Germany and also in France to this day. These are known to be wine countries. People traded in wine as if it was cash. Debts would be paid in wine. If you wanted to invest in the economy, it was almost impossible to avoid investment in wine, which meant what should a Jew do if a non-Jew owes him a debt and pays it back in wine? Technically, the Jew cannot derive any benefit from that wine, can't resell it, can't use it as cash, in which case he can't really participate in the non-Jewish economy, which is a problem for Jews living in the Middle Ages. They need to make money somehow, and participating in the economy is a life and death matter. Could a Jew invest in non-Jewish vineyards? Vineyards were an important form of investment. So how could a Jew participate in the financial economy without ever coming across a situation in which he would be forced to invest in a non-Jewish vineyard? So that's one major change, is the massive quantity of wine drunk and produced in 10th, 11th, 12th century Germany and onward. Two, the Jews were much tinier communities, not physically tinier, assuming they were same size, but the communities in Europe were much smaller than the Jewish communities in Babylonia, and this meant that Jews could not provide their own labor. They needed non-Jews to work their fields, to work their vineyards, to crush their wines. Wine has a very short period in the year in which it can be produced, and all the grapes have to be crushed and put into barrels during this short time period. And simply there weren't enough Jews to get all the work done by themselves, and they needed to rely on non-Jews for harvesting and for crushing and for transporting, which are all problematic according to the Talmud, and we'll see that as we go along. This is true in many other fields too. They needed non-Jews to work in their homes. They had non-Jewish servants. If the non-Jew pours some wine and therefore it becomes prohibited, and then they pour that wine, prohibition could go back into the barrels. All of the wine in a Jew's home could become prohibited from a very simple action by a non-Jewish servant. And that's something the sages had to cope with. And three is a major question that comes up throughout this period: is Christianity idolatrous? Were Christians in medieval Europe truly idolatrous, or do they just have some kind of idolatrous heritage? How do we deal with Christians in this period? And we'll see that, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. So these are some of the major questions. I taught this for an entire year at the Conservative Yeshiva. I think it's one of the most fascinating topics in post-Talmudic history. The Dapim are full of self-contradictions, and working out the particulars of these laws is not an easy feat, and I hope you'll try your best to follow along, and hope we'll have some interesting discussion about the matter.